about Pakistan's nuclear arms, or a part of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal ending up in terrorists' hands. That is something we'll discuss later in the show. But other than that, the ability or the speed with which Pakistan is increasing its nuclear arsenal, its capacity to produce nuclear weapons, is also becoming a source of concern. Like, for example, in this article, Bruce Rydell, who's a former CIA official and now a scholar on Pakistan in Brookings, says that Pakistan is producing nuclear weapons faster than any other country. Do you think these concerns are genuine, are legitimate?
No, I don't think so. I think up to a point, I think that leads to weaponization or proliferation of weapons is a cause of concern. But so far as Pakistan is concerned, I think the danger of its nuclear assets falling into the hands of any undesirable elements is next to nothing. It doesn't really exist. I mean, Pakistan has a large army, Pakistan has a security apparatus which is one of the biggest in this region. And the nuclear weapons, they have been an obsession with Pakistan, because Pakistan developed them in defiance of big powers and in constant threat, real or imaginary, of preemptive strikes either by India or by Israel. And therefore, security of nuclear assets has been sort of built into the nuclear culture of Pakistan. So I don't think there is any danger of that whatsoever. Now, coming to the other part of your question, the nuclear ambitions of Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't have the resources, the cash or supply resources to be ambitious. What it really wants is, and what it seeks at the moment, is to maintain a certain nuclear stability in this volatile part of the world. There's been a reference to India, there's been a reference to Pakistan, and there is a reference to Iran. I'm a former ambassador to Iran as well, and so I have some limited insight into their nuclear thinking, not much, but limited one. So I think given these parameters, it's very difficult for Pakistan to act unilaterally and satisfy what I would call the deliberately and tactically deliberately exaggerated concerns of the international community led by the United States.
Right. Now, Ambassador Khan, I'd like to ask you that when Kokab talks about Pakistan's military, Pakistan's nuclear arsenals falling into the wrong hands, there's another perception. If WikiLeaks are to be believed, there was a cable sent by Ann Patterson in which she says that she is not so much concerned about perhaps militant elements catching on to the nuclear arsenal as much as she is concerned about certain elements within the army, taking them out and handing them over to some other authorities. How genuine do you think that concern is?
I think it's absolutely impossible. I mean, it is true, in our pervasive culture of terrorism, sympathies and this and that, there are elements which cannot be entirely trusted. I mean, in the case of the naval base in Karachi, there were all kinds of suspicions, and therefore one has to be mindful of them. But I think when it comes to that, the armed forces have a ruthless system of internal audit. I mean, their own surveillance of their own cadres, if I may say, and particularly those that are suspicious, has become a lot more efficient, a lot more reliable in the last few years than it used to be. The entire idea of strengthening the command and control structures in Pakistan has been to make sure that nothing untoward happens. So at the moment, I mean, barring something extremely unlikely, a foreign invasion or something which totally destabilizes Pakistan, I think I would completely rule out any such threat or danger.
And also, I mean, I think you'd agree with me. Right, go ahead, Kokab.
But I had a follow-up question to what I had asked at the top of the show from Ambassador Khan. Ambassador Khan, in the beginning, when Pakistan went nuclear and conducted its nuclear tests in 1998, we heard that there is a certain number of nuclear weapons that are required to maintain the position in which no country dare attack Pakistan with nuclear weapons. Now, We keep hearing the number goes up. What is a number on which everybody can settle on, that after which no more nuclear weapons will be developed? We are now safe. It's our deterrence. Because I know it for a fact that Pakistan went nuclear in response to when India went nuclear, and it was presented as a deterrent.
As you say, it's been a reactive program, reacting to India's testing of Buddha in 1974 and subsequent developments. I mean, that is a basic fact. Now, what is the ceiling? I mean, I think you're thinking of the ceiling in Pakistan's case. I think it's very difficult to put a number. But one thing one can safely say is that Pakistan does not need a large arsenal, because it's basically a deterrent. And a certain ratio, I think you are mindful of that, you work to that. But there's absolutely no point in Pakistan accumulating nuclear warheads beyond a certain point. Now that point is determined by the size of the Indian nuclear sort of program, which has been greatly facilitated, I regret to say, by the Indo-US nuclear deal. It is a discriminatory law as far as we are concerned. And that makes our own situation, the stability situation, not a static one but a dynamic one. But having said that, there is no case for us to develop a very large arsenal. We are not competing with China, we are not competing with any of the Western powers. We just want to maintain a regional balance, which is not at all geared to war fighting. And we sometimes react to certain things. I mean, for instance, in the last 10 years or so, despite the growing sort of relations between India and the United States, New Delhi has been repeatedly, so they have talked repeatedly of the possibility of a limited war with Pakistan under a nuclear overhang. Now that of course creates its own anxieties and a wave of fear in Pakistan, and it has generated something which I opposed publicly. It generated a demand for what is sort of popularly known as the tactical nuclear weapons. We have short-range missiles, which they could have been used tactically any time, but there is now a pressure to build warheads which are deliverable, a kind of nuclear artillery, if I may say. Right. It's a regrettable development, but again, once again, the dynamics of it are rooted in the Indo-Pakistan, the lack of strategic restraint between these two subcontinental neighbors.
Right, Ambassador Khan, but why the renewed pressure on Pakistan at this point in time? Because if you recall, till about last year, the US, whether they were just mere rhetorical statements or whether they actually meant it, they were of the opinion that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is very safe. So why this renewed pressure at this point in time?
Well, I think two.
And they've also spent quite a bit on...
two factors.
Right.
I think two factors. One is that as far as we are concerned, Pakistan's nuclear program was very strongly opposed by the United States. I mean, this was an act of defiance on the part of Pakistan. Stealth, clandestine, all kinds of underhand deals, and finally we arrived and we tested. Now, once we tested India and Pakistan in the same month, Washington resorted to diplomacy. But if you go back to that diplomacy, it was a very capable predecessor of our guest in Washington today. You see from the word go, from the very beginning, the conversations with Jaswant Singh and with Shamshad Ahmad on our side, they were different. They were differentiated. In one case, Washington was moving towards an increasing acceptance of India as a nuclear weapon capable power. On the other hand, there is evidence right from the beginning that there were efforts to dissuade Pakistan from continuing on that path.
But to an extent, the US did turn a blind eye when they needed Pakistan, whether it was during the Afghan jihad or after 2001. So they did turn a blind eye. But my question is, why the renewed pressure at this point in time for the FMCT?
No, FMCT, I think, I would not question the intentions there. What you said in your very excellent introduction, I do believe that President Obama has a nuclear vision which is different from that of the preceding administrations in Washington. And I do believe that he has taken some steps. But how far he can go, it is yet to be seen, because we are already beginning to see Obama slide down and down from what he was during the campaign and during the early phase of his administration. So that sort of problem still remains. But I think he is well intentioned. He wants a nuclear weapon-free, though he knows that it is on the cards for a very long time to come. I mean, while, as you said, there is a replacement by that is, but Russia, United States itself, and perhaps China, they will not really agree to a total abolition or destruction of nuclear stockpiles for a very long time to come.
Ambassador Khan, allow me, Dr. Mansoor Khan has joined us, and I'd like to put a question towards him as well. Dr. Khan, pleasure to have you here with us, sir. Dr. Khan, now, how real do you think, because Pakistan keeps on building on its nuclear stockpile, on its nuclear arsenal, because of the existential threat that we face from India, how real do you think this threat is? Because the US in recent days has termed this threat not so real. They have said that, Pakistan needs to focus on other avenues rather than focusing on the threat from our eastern borders.
Well, Pakistan's threat perception towards India, coming from India, is based on ground realities. Number one, India continues to add on to its overwhelming conventional superiority, and all the major powers of the world, including the United States, as part of the broader strategic partnership, are adding to that capability by providing them access to high technology areas such as force multipliers and ABM systems, anti-ballistic missile systems, which are extremely destabilizing. Secondly, because of the Indo-US deal, India is poised towards building a nuclear arsenal which would be something around 400 warheads on land, sea and air platforms, which would provide them with assured second strike capability. And thirdly, 70% of India's assets, conventional force assets, are all deployed against Pakistan.
Welcome back. You're watching The Platform, and we're talking about the nuclear ambitions of Pakistan, Iran, and India. We are still trying to get our guest Nicholas Burns here from Harvard in Massachusetts. But in the meantime, I'd like to go to Islamabad and ask Ambassador Tanvir Khan. Ambassador Tanvir Khan, the question is about the diplomatic aspect that needs to support Pakistan's nuclear program. Now, again, it's not recent that we see the concerns raised by some section of the Western media or the research community in the Western world. This recent report by Stockholm International Peace Research Institute again shows concerns about Pakistan's losing control of part of its nuclear arsenal to the terrorists, something that we mentioned at the top of the show. Now, what does Pakistan need to do diplomatically to put to rest these concerns once and for all?
Well, there is no evidence whatsoever of any really serious problem about nuclear security in Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan's record there is much better than even the old established nuclear weapon powers. I think this is a part of the campaign to persuade Pakistan, even now, either to give it the nuclear option up altogether or to limit it as much as possible. I think this is a fixation, and the real causes of that, I was hoping that your guest in Washington would really sort of enlighten us on that, because the exaggerated concern that we see in the United States and preoccupation with Pakistan's nuclear program and this constant refrain that terrorists or some group can seize them, I think it adds to Pakistan's anxieties, and that only stiffens Pakistan's resolve to maintain its own independent nuclear deterrent. It doesn't help Pakistan move towards nuclear disarmament, because that, of course, would take a great deal. That would take major decisions by by India. What is needed? You mentioned diplomacy. What has been lacking since 1998, when we became an overt sort of nuclear region, is the lack of progress between India and Pakistan on strategic issues. Pakistan has repeatedly proposed to India a serious dialogue on that restraint. Indians have shied away and they usually cite the example of China, that they are not preoccupied just with the Pakistani nuclear program, they also have to take care of the Chinese capabilities. And from time to time, I mean, while we are talking these days, a number of Indian military personnel, generals and others, serving and retired, have spoken up. They want a huge army strung along the Himalayas, and their claim is that there is a strong threat from Tibet, from the Chinese. Now, this again is something which is used as an argument to secure even larger budgets. India has pursued a huge armament program. Now, Pakistan is in no position to compete with India on the conventional front. We have been outclassed. We have been outcashed. I mean, you know, we just haven't got the money and the resources, and we also haven't got the suppliers. I mean, India can today order the state-of-the-art, the latest weapon systems from the United States, which have not been inducted into the American forces, and Israel is another source, direct or indirect, for American technology, American weapons. Now, Pakistan is constrained, and therefore that increases the reliance on a nuclear deterrence to deter a possible attack, particularly
while we are on the subject of the United States helping India, let me go to Dr. Khan and ask him this question. Dr. Khan, before the break you were talking about India producing nuclear weapons in a large quantity. How much do you think India's capacity has increased because of the US-India civilian nuclear deal that was signed, and the critics at that time called the deal overly beneficial or favorable for India? Do you think that deal has enabled India to go ahead with with the production of its nuclear arsenal?
Absolutely.
It provides India with the framework. So was it from me or from Mansoor?
That was
from Mansoor.
Mansoor Khan.
Okay. Absolutely. The Indo-US deal has directly contributed to vertical proliferation in South Asia. I'll just cite a few statistics. Right now, India has around 1,000 kilograms of weapon-grade plutonium and around 3,000 kilograms of reactor-grade plutonium, which is weapon usable. India has been allowed to keep a significant part of its nuclear weapons program outside international safeguards under the Indo-US deal. And by virtue of that arrangement, India will be able to produce around 130 kilograms of weapon-grade plutonium from each of its 5 breeder reactors, which would be outside safeguards, and which India plans to build up till the year 2020. In addition to that, power reactors, that heavy water power reactors that would be kept outside safeguards under the deal, would be able to produce 1,250 kilograms of reactor-grade plutonium every year. And add to this another of their 100 megawatt plutonium production reactor, which will produce around 27 kilograms of weapon-grade plutonium each year. So India will be able to produce around 500 warheads, or maybe more, depending on the design of the warheads, each year from this amount of material which they have, in addition to their growing uranium enrichment program, which is also outside safeguards under the Indo-US.
Dr. Khan?
Yes, and I'll just add a few things. In addition to these, the quantity of the fissile materials, the Indians have already publicly stated that they want to build a triad, which would be around 400 warheads, which would be based on air, land, and sea platforms, and they are already building nuclear submarines. They're planning to add 5 submarines in the next decade. And those submarines would enable India to deploy ballistic missiles at sea, which would be nuclear capable, and that is essentially going to provide them with an assured second strike capability. And coupled with ballistic missile defense, in which recently NATO it has been reported that the US and NATO has agreed to share technology with India in BMD systems, that is going to adversely affect strategic stability, and that will serve to neutralize Pakistan's modest deterrent capability in the region.
Dr. Khan, under the terms, Maria, if you have a question, you can go ahead. Otherwise, I just wanted to ask Dr. Khan a follow-up question. Dr. Khan, under the terms of the civilian nuclear deal that was signed between the United States and India, how much do you think the United States shares the responsibility of, according to you, not keeping enough safeguards built in the deal to keep a check on India that you are now saying may lead to an unhealthy competition in the region?
Well, at the time when the deal was being negotiated, there were concerns being raised by non-proliferation experts in the U.S. itself and in other countries that by accepting a significant part of India's weapons program, the U.S. would directly be contributing towards political proliferation in South Asia. And that includes India's plutonium production reactors, India's uranium enrichment program, its reprocessing facilities, and its heavy water and tritium production facilities, which directly adds to India's capability of improving the quality and quantity of its nuclear arsenal over a period of time. And that was a de facto recognition of India as a nuclear weapon state outside the NPT. And it's an irony that it was India's 1974 test that led to the nuclear cartel in the form of the nuclear suppliers group being formed in the mid-1970s. And now the same country is being provided a waiver and is being facilitated in enhancing its nuclear capability.
Right.
While the same has been denied to Pakistan.
Right, Ambassador Khan, we're of course talking about India being facilitated in one way or the other. Of course, analysts believe, and of course all of us here in Pakistan also believe, that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal or Pakistan's military arsenal has always been defensive. It's always been reactionary to what India does on the other side of the border. Now, keeping that in view, how fair do you think this deal was, and shouldn't the United States have been more pragmatic as far as dealing with India and Pakistan, considering the history that we share?
I would say that this should have been more even-handed. I mean, pragmatic too, but certainly more even-handed. But the Bush administration was so anxious to court India, to win over India, that India was able to set the agenda. And since the administration in Washington was trying to beat certain deadlines, they ended up by making concessions which perhaps they were not entirely sure of even themselves. The arrangement has not been smooth since then. I mean, there have been difficulties in its implementation because Indians have their own mind, they have their own, there are problems about nuclear liability in case of an accident or something. There are all kinds of problems. Right. And there is certain opposition to the deal, even now in India. But the principle from our point of view is that this is what Mansoor was trying to say, that it set India free to divert its entire indigenous fissile material production to weaponization. I mean, you know, India's other needs for power, etc., could be met from outside. And we saw it began with the United States. But as Pakistan warned, it did not remain with the United States. Other actors jumped into it, France, Russia. I mean, everything. India has the money. India pays cash. We saw that in the case of the top of the range aircraft, how the French and the Americans competed, their allies. I mean, it was nobody's business. I mean, all kinds of things happened. Now, that is the problem, that India is free, and India is going to have a huge nuclear power generation program. We have no quarrel with that. We would like to have more nuclear power generation too, but in our case, the ceiling would be reached very quickly. We may have 2 or 3 or at the most 4 nuclear reactors. As I said earlier on, we do not have the money, we do not have the resources, and therefore we would have to rely on other things. But India can probably take its own nuclear power component in the total energy sort of
So should
portfolio.
we be fearing India in that context?
Well, personally, I think I'm not really arguing on the basis that there is any great threat to Pakistan from India. I think India has mobilized 2 or 3 times. I mean, way back in 1986-87, there was a massive confrontation across the borders, and then in 1990, I handled it in the Foreign Office, I remember it very well. And then again in 2001, 2002, during the Musharraf era. And the whole concept of the limited war possibility really got sort of stood on its head. India could not take it to its logical conclusion. So I think India also has had serious sort of second thoughts, though there are hawks there who then sort of seized on the cold start doctrine that if we can, and it's a question of capability. There are developments on the Indian eastern seaboard. There is a huge new base near Goa, and that will project power. And only the other day, the head of India's nuclear advisory board, Mr. Bajpai, he is a very distinguished man, very distinguished diplomat. Now, he has said, I think it was only in the last 1 or 2 days, that India's strategic reach begins at Suez and stretches up to Shanghai. Now, that is not just the Indian Ocean. I mean, he's crossed the Strait of Malacca, he's gone into the South China Sea. Now, if a country has that kind of grandiose ambitions, then the neighbors always feel a little bit jittery. I don't sort of think that in the foreseeable future, India would invade Pakistan or something. But one reason why we are able to maintain peace here is the ambiguity about the nuclear weapons. And therefore, Pakistan keeps on pursuing in a limited way. I mean, and I hope it will remain limited. We don't need a large arsenal. We learned it from the Cold War. There is no point in matching weapon to weapon, warhead to warhead. You don't need that. That's not deterrence. If one single missile gets through, with all the protective umbrellas, even that would be a deterrent. So I think without being an alarmist, I think one would have to support a gradual, calibrated increment in Pakistan's nuclear capabilities, so that what becomes obsolete also gets replaced.
Right. Now, I want to cross over to Dr. Khan. Dr. Khan, now initially we were talking about signing of the FMCT, and there is a lot of pressure on Pakistan. In fact, a news report circulated a few weeks back which said that the United States says that if Pakistan does not agree to it, they will be asked to forcefully do it. They will be forced to do it. Now, do you think Pakistan should sign the FMCT?
I think Pakistan's position on the FMCT is purely based on its own security perception, on what it feels is necessary to maintain the credibility of its minimum deterrent. As Ambassador Tanvir Ahmad Khan just said, Pakistan is not doesn't have the capability or the plans to match India for bomb to bomb. We don't have the money for it, and we have no intentions of doing that. Having said that, Pakistan's current focus is on improving the quality of its nuclear arsenal, and for that we need to produce more plutonium, and that is the material in which India enjoys enormous quantitative superiority over Pakistan. Because if you want to build warheads for missiles, which can easily be deployed on submarines and on aircraft and on cruise missiles, those warheads are essentially based on plutonium as fissile material. In addition to that, it also allows you to produce tritium, which is thermonuclear fuel, which allows you to produce hydrogen bombs. So Pakistan's main focus right now is improving the quality of its arsenal rather than the quantity of its arsenal, and that is exactly why the United States doesn't want Pakistan to produce more fissile material right now, because it feels that it would be coming at par with India as a first-rate nuclear power. Having said that, again, I think in the long term, maybe after Pakistan feels that it is comfortable with the stocks of plutonium which it right now has, Pakistan may consider signing the FMCT.
Dr. Khan, pleasure to have you here with us, sir. Thank you for joining us on the platform. And now let's cross over to Washington. Kokab, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and it's a pleasure for me to announce that Ambassador Nicholas Burns has just joined us. Ambassador Burns served as the Undersecretary of State of Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008 when he led the negotiations on the US-India nuclear civilian agreement and was the lead negotiator on Iran's nuclear program. He also served as the US ambassador to NATO. Ambassador Burns is currently a professor of diplomacy and international politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. Ambassador Burns, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Now, at the top of the show, we talked about, of course, India-US civilian nuclear deal. You led the negotiations, and the question on many Pakistanis' minds was, why India and not Pakistan, or why only India and not Pakistan?
Well, I think you have to remember, and thank you very much for inviting me on your show, you have to remember that the times and the United States and India were embarked on building a major strategic relationship. India, in the realm of civil nuclear affairs and nuclear affairs, had not been a proliferator of its nuclear technology. Pakistan certainly had. India was willing to submit itself to international supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency as a result of the civil nuclear deal in 2008. India committed to put 14 of its 22 existing civil nuclear reactors under IAEA monitoring and all of its future breeder reactors. Pakistan, of course, not willing to make those commitments, but the major problem, of course, with Pakistan was the AQ-Khan network. The fact that Pakistan is one of the most significant proliferators in the world, and it made it impossible for the United States to think that we could establish a civil nuclear agreement with Pakistan along the lines of the one we established with India. It would never have been suggested by President Bush or Secretary Condoleezza Rice. It never would have been approved by the Congress, a deal with Pakistan. And it certainly would not have been approved by the nuclear suppliers group, the 45 countries around the world that had to agree by consensus to support the US-India deal. None of those factors were in place with Pakistan because of Pakistan's very sorry record of being one of the world's major proliferators of nuclear technology.
Ambassador Burns, we'll come to Dr. Khan's subject. Of course, Pakistan's nuclear issue cannot be discussed without bringing him up. But it was said in the show before you joined us that thanks to this deal, India's hands were free and India was able to produce or increase its nuclear arsenal. And it was primarily because of this deal that India was enabled to do that. How would you respond to this criticism?
Well, I don't think that assertion is correct at first. And second, I'd say the civil nuclear agreement between the United States and India was solely about civil nuclear cooperation. It had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. In fact, you'll remember in March of 2006 when President Bush visited India, he insisted that as part of this deal there be a separation between India's civil and nuclear facilities so that we could be assured that when American firms or French or Russian firms began to work on the civil nuclear side with India, none of that would bring support to the military side of India's nuclear complex. So that separation for us was very important. I think you have to go look to other reasons for the nuclear buildup in South Asia, certainly competition from China. Secondarily, the very poor relations between India and Pakistan. Those factors to me would be much more weighty in explaining the nuclear buildup in South Asia as we see it by a number of countries.
Let me ask Ambassador Tanvir Khan this question. Ambassador Tanvir Khan, are you satisfied with the justification that Ambassador Burns gave? He quoted the episode of Dr. AQ Khan as one of the major stumbling blocks in allowing Pakistan the same kind of deal that the United States entered with India. Do you think Dr. Khan's chapter is still alive? You think Pakistan has done enough to put it to rest forever?
Well, to accuse Pakistan of being a major proliferator, I think this is a strange kind of determinism. I mean, I concede that there might have been things in the past when command and control structures in Pakistan were rather in their embryonic stage. Now, the Pakistani response to the international concern on that score has been magnificent. AQ Khan has done his penance, and Pakistan has strengthened all possible, removed all possible loopholes. And there is not a shred of evidence since then. These are events which go back far in time. Go back to 80s, 86, 87 or something. Now, since then, I don't think the United States or anyone else has ever produced a shred of evidence that Pakistan is in any way involved with in proliferation. So I think this is an argument. It's a self-justifying argument. It's built up. It's built up to pursue other objectives. The Bush administration, as I said earlier, was in a terrible hurry to win India in the strategic sort of alignments in this part of the world, because that's part of the larger US agenda for this region, and they were prepared to pay a price for it. Now, he mentioned the 45 countries, the nuclear suppliers group, but I think he, more than anyone else knows, because he was a major actor in that, the pressure that the United States brought to bear on members of the nuclear suppliers group. There were reservations in Australia till the very end, and country after country sort of succumbed to the American pressure to give India a free hand. I think this kind of proactive diplomacy on the part of the United States to do something in this region, which was so lacking in even-handedness, in fair play, I think that destabilized the nuclear security sort of arrangements in South Asia, and in a way became instrumental in triggering off a kind of arms race, which now obviously is a cause of concern. But as I said, I'll repeat, Pakistan is in no position to build a large arsenal. Pakistan would always would have to be satisfied with a minimum deterrent capability. Now, as far as FMCT is concerned, there are options. There is nothing that Pakistan can do about them. You can take them out of Geneva, you can take them to New York, but you cannot force Pakistan to sign that treaty or whatever instrument you develop. Now, that will have to be done by proactive diplomacy in the region so that the Indo-Pakistan contention is resolved. What Pakistan seeks is a grand reconciliation with India and a grand strategic design in which it becomes unnecessary for countries here to pursue the nuclear path.
Maria, would you please let Ambassador Burns respond to the remarks that Ambassador Tanvir Khan has just made? Yes, Ambassador Burns.
Well, I simply say that I think it's very unwise to deny that the AQ Khan network was not a major factor in the thinking of the United States or other countries. The AQ Khan network was a serial proliferator of nuclear technology to the worst regimes in the world. That network did enormous damage. It was never entirely repudiated in a convincing way by the Pakistani government. And I think that's what bothered countries, not just my own country, but countries all around the world, that the Pakistani government put this individual under house arrest, but never really meted out the kind of criminal sentencing, long-term jail sentence that one would think would have happened for someone who is one of the worst violators of proliferation in modern nuclear history. So that was a major factor. And I wouldn't discount the nuclear suppliers group. It wasn't just the fact that the United States was championing this agreement. Of course we were. It was our agreement with India. But countries that are not allied to the United States, like China, and neutral countries like Sweden and Finland and Austria and Ireland decided to support it. That tells you that there was great trust in the international community concerning India, that the government of Manmohan Singh was considered to be a credible government, a government that would stick to its word, and that I'm sorry to say that the international community did not have, I think, the same confidence in Pakistan because of the activities of the AQ Khan network. So for all of us, this loomed very large in the decision-making. It was a major factor in the decision-making, and I think the Pakistanis and the Pakistani government need to realize what a hole they've dug for their country. Now, how do you get out of that hole? You have to demonstrate that you're willing to play by the rules that the international community and the United Nations have established. And certainly limiting the production of nuclear weapons and signing the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty would be good starters for that, but I don't see any indication that Pakistan has even begun to consider such steps that would give it credibility in the international community.
Maria, do you have a question for Ambassador Burns?
Right. I'd like to ask
Yes.
Mr. Khan, he wants to add on something.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what I'd like to say is Pakistan doesn't have unlimited capacity for expansion of its nuclear arsenal. It's a very limited capacity. And it's entirely possible that Pakistan might have added a few warheads now. But I think in the overall context of the nuclear balance in this region, Pakistan is not really violating anything fundamental. I think if at all we need a certain persuading a country here, it is India that needs to be persuaded to come to the conference table with Pakistan and discuss nuclear restraint regime. There are all kinds of measures. I mean, Mr. Mansoor knows much better than I do. The deployment and this and that, we can have an entire set of confidence-building measures that would assuage Pakistan's fears. In fact, the American diplomacy in New Delhi has kept alive the Indian sort of option, the so-called option. I don't buy it, but the so-called Indian option of a limited war with Pakistan under a nuclear overhang. I'm afraid the United States has added to that fear, and in that sense, the American policies in this part of South Asia have actually been a destabilizing factor. I think it is time Pakistan has accepted all assistance. Pakistan has turned to the United States to get better nuclear security. And Pakistan is a strategic partner. And yet, this whole business of repeating 20-year-old allegations as if something happened yesterday, I think it's very unfair to Pakistan.
Maria, let us bring Iran, because we are, I think, literally just 5 minutes away from closing of the show, and we haven't discussed Iran. Let me ask Ambassador Burns. Ambassador Burns, I have this article of the New York Times, and it says that the Iranian government is offering the international inspectors full supervision of the country's nuclear activities for the next 5 years, but on the condition that the mounting sanctions against Iran are lifted. It also says that the term full supervision is vaguely mentioned here. There is no detail of what that full supervision would entail. How do you look at this offer from Iran?
I do not believe it's a credible offer by the Iranian government. Look, this is a government that for 5 years now has been avoiding and disregarding the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. It's going ahead with its enrichment program at Natanz in violation of the 4 sanctions resolutions passed between December 2006 and 2010. The New York Times also reported recently that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is seriously concerned that Iran is now proceeding with its nuclear program, is not cooperating with the IAEA, and so I think there's every reason to believe that the international community's attention is now going to be much more seriously put upon Iran, that I would hope that we would consider new sanctions measures, both unilateral sanctions by individual countries and collective sanctions by the United Nations. The Iranian government has given no indication whatsoever that it's serious about cooperation with the IAEA. If you look at the public reports that the IAEA publishes and makes available worldwide, it shows that the Iranians are not cooperating to the extent that they must with the IA, with the United Nations. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned about this government of Iran. It also continues to be the leading sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East. And of course, it's been a very negative actor in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So there are a lot of reasons why the entire world community should be concerned by the increasingly radical behavior of this notorious regime in Tehran.
Ambassador Burns, I wish we had more time to get into the nitty-gritty of Iran's nuclear program, but I would ask you a question that is like a very broad question, and that is the United States always faces this accusation from a lot of people in Pakistan of double standard. Now, when it comes to Pakistan, people refer to India, and when it comes to Iran, people refer to Israel. You have this opportunity tonight to talk to people of Pakistan and tell them about what is it about this. Is there a double standard in play here, that Pakistan is treated differently than India and Iran is treated differently than Israel?
No, I don't think so at all. I'm a professor at Harvard University now. I'm no longer with the U.S. government. I can only speak for myself. I don't speak for the U.S. government, but I can say that there's no double standard that I'm aware of in American attitudes towards Pakistan. If you look at the amount of assistance, economic assistance, humanitarian assistance after the earthquake in Pakistan, military assistance, the United States has been a very good friend and a very generous friend to Pakistan. I don't think that's a double standard at work. In terms of India and Pakistan relations, there is certainly significant activities that the United States and Pakistan undertake together that the United States and India do not, and the reverse is true as well. We're not going to match deed for deed the activities of cooperation activities we undertake with India with those of Pakistan and vice versa. So the two countries are entirely separate, should be in our minds. I know when Secretary Condi Rice in 2005 became Secretary of State, she believed that we ought to dehyphenate our policy towards India and Pakistan. We ought to have separate policies towards the two, and I think the U.S. has been a good friend to Pakistan in the ensuing years.
Maria, do you have a question from Ambassador Burns?
Right, Ambassador, I'd like to ask you that when we talk about double standards, and you just mentioned yourself that when it comes to Iran, Iran hasn't been following the guidelines for the past 5 years, and it does face a terrorist threat as well. Had that been the case with Pakistan, had Pakistan been avoiding, the consequences would have been much more dire for Pakistan if Pakistan was in a similar situation. Wouldn't you say that?
I think there's no reason to equate Pakistan and Iran. I would not make that comparison. Pakistan is a friendly country, a very important friend to the U.S., but certainly one cannot say the same about Iran.
The U.S. orders are not followed or the U.S. requests are not granted. Pakistan is threatened one too many times.
I was just about to say that the United States for 30 years has virtually had no relationship with the government of Iran. So I think that relationship is in serious disrepair. However, despite all the problems in the U.S.-Pakistani relationship, there's no question that the government in Pakistan and the United States government want to continue to have good relations. I must say that the episode over Osama bin Laden was a serious blow to this relationship here in the United States, because Americans looked at the fact that bin Laden had been living for 4 to 5 years in a villa very close to your military academy. It's hard to believe that he was there without notice by elements of your government. So I think there's more that Pakistan can do to assure the United States that Pakistan intends to be a good friend to our country.
Ambassador Burns, thank you very much for joining us this morning from Harvard.
Thank you very much.
Harvard's Kennedy School. And I would also like to thank our guests in Islamabad, Ambassador Khan and Professor Khan.